Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Patrick Savage. He is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Environment and Information Studies at Keio University, where he directs the CompMusic Lab for comparative and computational musicology. His research on the evolution of music and culture has appeared in outlets including Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, the New York Times, and the Economist. So, Dr. Savage, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Bom dia, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here. Loving being here in Portugal.
Yeah, bom dia. Yeah, that's nice, and I hope the conference is going well. So,
It's fantastic. I'm here for the International Council for Traditional Music Conference, World Conference being held in Lisbon.
yeah, great, great. So let's get into music then. What do we know about the evolution of music?
Not as much as I would like. Um, Darwin has talked about music and evolution since his early writings. He
Hmm.
called music the most mysterious, or one of the most mysterious faculties with which man is endowed. Uh, and he thought maybe it evolved to charm the opposite sex, and perhaps language evolved from music. And since then, a lot of people have speculated. We don't really have much firmer evidence for it. So that's one of the things that we try to do in my lab and in other labs that look at this question, is try to get a little bit more evidence. But it's hard because music, unlike bones, doesn't fossilize. So you have to get kind of indirect evidence to understand how and why it may have evolved.
Hmm. So you mentioned language there. Are there similarities between music, language, and birdsong, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, uh, music and language are both two of the uh, aspects that are found in all human cultures. There's no society that doesn't make music, and there's no society that doesn't use language. And the most universal form of music is song, which is, of course, made with a voice, which is the same thing that we use to make speech. Um, and it's also the same, it's related evolutionarily to the vocalizations of birds and of whales and of primates. So they all use the same, evolutionary capacities. They serve some similar functions. Um, they activate similar areas of the brain. The areas that process language can also process music, and vice versa. But yet there are some really interesting differences, and we're trying to kind of figure out exactly what those are and why they might be. And likewise with birdsong and animal song, we're still trying to understand, is it more like music? Is it more like language? Is it like neither? So some of my research, we try to get some data on this, quantitative data, by actually comparing them, using spectrograms and things like that. But there's not really a lot of that kind of research done, so we're still in pretty early stages of understanding exactly how and why these things are different or the same.
So we're not still sure if there's a phylogenetic relationship between, for example, bird song and language and or music, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we say phylogenetic relationship, there are many phylogenetic relationships, right? Because we're all related.
Mm.
Humans and birds are evolutionarily related, um, but birds are more distantly related to us than mammals.
Yeah.
And the curious thing in evolution is that humans are the only primates that have complex learned vocalizations, which we call songs.
Hmm.
So most other primates, they vocalize, but they don't sing songs. They don't learn vocalizations from others and pass those on. They just have innate calls. But many birds do learn songs and pass them on, and also some other species like whales and dolphins. So it seems that the neural circuitry that's required for this, which is this capability called vocal learning,
Hmm.
seems to be something that's not direct kind of evolutionary homology. It's rather an example of convergent evolution, where the same capabilities can evolve in different lineages, perhaps for the same reasons. Um, but what those reasons are not quite known. So some people think maybe they evolved, again, like Darwin said, to charm the opposite sex. Maybe it evolved through sexual selection.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say maybe it evolved to bond groups or individuals together. So maybe it's a sociality kind of thing. And our group has kind of argued it can be both. Music could have evolved to bond individuals together, which can include kind of group bonding, and it can also include mate bonding, pair bonding. It can include bonding between parents and their children, the so-called, lullabies or parentees could also be sort of one manifestation of this social bonding function of music. So that's our kind of hypothesis. But again, it's by no means settled. We don't really have such great data yet. So we hope to test that with more kind of data going forward.
It's not settled, but is it that any of those hypotheses have more support, scientific support, than the others? I mean, what do we really know about the functions of music, particularly the potential social functions?
Well, we know a lot indirectly through some of our comparative work, cross-cultural work about the ways that music tends to function in different societies. We know a little bit through neuroscience about the ways that certain brain areas are connected to others. We know a little bit from cross-species work. And we know a little bit from archaeology. Although song doesn't fossilize, some musical instruments do, like you can have bone flutes going back 30,000 years at least.
Yeah.
You can track the bones of our larynx to see when maybe the larynx may have descended to allow for some of these capabilities of singing or speaking. You can try to get at them, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions. So Darwin's mate selection hypothesis, sexual selection hypothesis, has been not very welcomed, largely because, so maybe people say maybe it makes sense for some kinds of animal song, because bird song and some other songs do tend to be largely sung by males to court females.
Yeah.
Whereas in humans, there doesn't seem to be any biological differences in capabilities to make music. There do seem to be very, very strong cultural restrictions on female music making. So in our study in 2015, we looked at lots of musical recordings from around the world and tested various different hypotheses about what kinds of features may be more or less universal. And one of the more surprising to some people findings was that actually male performance did tend to predominate throughout basically all regions of the world, tend to be dominated by male music, especially instruments were very dominated by males. Singing was still dominated by males, but less so.
Yeah.
But so there's cultural differences, very much gendered in music. But as soon as you take away these cultural restrictions, saying religious reasons or kind of cultural reasons, saying women should not play this instrument, women should not sing, it's too associated with like prostitution, so we don't want any of our women making music. That's a men's thing. But once you take away these restrictions, then women play great instruments and make great singers, and sometimes quite often they will then outnumber men in terms of singers or instrumentalists. So it doesn't seem to be any kind of biological constraints on female music making. It's cultural restriction. Whereas in many birds, there's actually biological differences in the brains of songbirds that kick in and activate their singing that is not found in females. It's not all birds though; it gets complicated. But so that's the kind of evidence you might look at to sort of disprove one hypothesis, but it's not conclusive, I guess.
And what is the role played by culture and cultural evolution in music?
It's huge. Like most cultural attributes, music is highly variable based on the culture. So I live in Japan, and I've learned to sing Japanese folk songs, and there's all kinds of traditional Japanese musics. I've dabbled in some of them, like shamisen and koto. And especially with some of the older, more kind of long continuing traditions in Japan, like say gagaku music of the imperial court, it's very unusual to Western ears and can sound strange. The harmonies sound unlike anything you hear in Western music. The rhythms don't seem to kind of have a clear beat the way Western music does. And same if you go to anywhere around the world, people are often struck by how unusual the music sounds. Sometimes they like it because it sounds exotic. Sometimes they hate it because it doesn't sound like what they're used to. So people have always thought, wow, it's so much different music. And yet there are so many features that are also the same. Not in every single piece of music in every culture, but most music in most cultures tends to have pretty regular rhythms based on 2 beats, fairly simple scales based on up to 7 different scale degrees. It's tend to have percussion instruments, tend to be made in groups, and so you'll find if you go to a different country, even if you don't know the language, and even if you're not familiar with the music, you can often kind of clap along, dance along, and really connect with other people through music who you can't connect with through language. You can't speak the same language. So that's a really curious paradox about music. It's so diverse, and yet it's somehow so universal, perhaps even more universal than language in some ways, which suggests both a role for culture. So culture evolution allows things to be very diverse, but there's also some kind of constraints that you can't just make any music in any way you want and have that style continue. There's certain things it has to be. And a good example, a counterexample for this perhaps would be 20th century kind of avant-garde or serialist music. So famous composers like Arnold Schoenberg, he kind of famously said, the only reason that we have this classical tonal music that has these restrictions is just the way the history went. If I make up a new style where instead of using 7 major or minor scale degrees, I'll use all of the 12 notes of a chromatic scale, and I'll put them together in a intentionally random way so that there's no sense of harmony and resolution. If I just play my music enough, people are going to be humming this on the streets. They just need to be exposed to it enough. So he did that, and many composers kind of tried to do this. And in historical terms, it was kind of a failure, but it was also a beautiful natural experiment that you can't just make any music you want and make people like it or remember it just by making them listen to it. There's something that's kind of innate, that's shaping the kinds of music that we find more or less pleasing. So there's kind of an interplay between cultural evolution and biological constraints.
And in your work, you also study cross-cultural regularities. What are these, and do they exist in musical evolution?
Yeah, so the kind of features that I mentioned before that are found in most music, so like these regular meters based on 2 beats, these scales based on up to 7 notes, things like that, and they tend. Our interpretation is most of these features we find in most musics tend to facilitate like synchronization and harmonization. So having very predictable rhythms, sort of a simple, repetitive, fixed set of pitches allows us to kind of predict what other people are, what they're going to sing and when they're going to sing it. It allows us to synchronize our singing, synchronize our dancing, to harmonize our melodies, and to help us kind of perform together. And this process of synchronization helps to bond us together. And there's quite a lot of experimental evidence too that shows that if you get people to synchronize, they actually kind of bond more together. They'll be more cooperative. They're more likely to kind of be generous with money, or more likely to feel like they're part of the same team. So yeah, these regularities we speculate are kind of related to social bonding.
So there's a connection between synchrony and cooperation, right?
Yes, there is. There's quite a lot of research suggesting, experimentally and correlational kind of studies suggesting that.
Mm-hmm. Is music a uniquely human phenomenon?
Great question. Some people would say yes. They would say an animal song is not music. Some people define music in terms of humanity. So it's very hard to define music. One of the most famous definitions that's the closest we could say to being accepted by ethnomusicologists is music is humanly organized sound. But if you just define it as being only human, then that's fine. But why should you do that? What about birdsong? And also, that doesn't really make any distinction between music and language. They're both organized sound. So most ethnomusicologists say, well, there's no universal way to differentiate between music and language. Every culture has its own way of distinguishing between speech and song. You can't define it. But so some people would say that you can't compare animal song with music because it has different functions. Animal song often tends to have more like clear function. Maybe it's territorial defense or mate advertising. But I think it's actually quite murky in animal song, and human song is also murky. It has sometimes clear, sometimes not so clear functions. As I said, they both use the voice. And one of the really striking findings that I think has increased people's willingness to look at animal song as potentially, a musical analog is animals can also synchronize to a beat. People thought for a long time they couldn't. And then around 2009, there was two studies came out simultaneously in the journal Current Biology, showing experimental and kind of correlational evidence showing that many animals could synchronize to beat if you train them well enough. And curiously, it was mainly, almost exclusively, animals that also had vocal learning. So, parrots, cockatoos, people would say elephants, although the evidence is not as strong. So there's maybe a connection between this capacity for vocal learning and the biological capacity for vocal learning I mentioned before, and the biological capacity for synchronizing to a beat, suggesting kind of deep evolutionary connections there. Now it's a little bit controversial. There's some mixed evidence, like a sea lion that can synchronize, but is maybe not a vocal learner, but maybe it is. But it's a very open question within the field. And I think more and more people are trying to look across species to understand, because as I said, music doesn't fossilize. So our best hope of really understanding the deep evolutionary roots may be comparing with the other species, related species that are around us. So I'm excited to try more of that research going forward.
Mm-hmm. Is there a relationship between musical evolution and human biological and cultural diversity? I mean, can we learn more about biological and cultural diversity by studying musical evolution?
Yeah, yes, we can. And that was kind of how I got started in my research career. So I started off as first I wanted to be a scientist, a chemist, and then I wanted to be a composer. I switched my undergraduate degree from like doing a chemistry internship to doing a composing thesis. And then I kind of found this way to combine music and science, which I did in the lab of Stephen Brown, my master's supervisor, who was one of the people who wrote this or edited this landmark book called The Origins of Music. And he was doing a project comparing musical diversity and linguistic diversity and genetic diversity started off with the indigenous peoples of Taiwan and was intended to kind of expand throughout the Pacific and the globe. So that was where I kind of got started on this comparative work, and was kind of comparing the musical patterns and comparing them with genetic and linguistic. And we found correlations. So this is not suggesting there's genes for music or, language causes music to be the way it is, but what they suggest is that they're all shaped by kind of historical evolutionary processes, both biological and cultural evolutionary processes. So when people go somewhere, they bring their languages with them, they bring their cultures with them. And so just as they kind of become genetically more different through kind of drift as they go throughout the world, so their languages also become different. There's everyone who, if you speak Portuguese, you know about this. It's Portuguese and Spanish are very similar, but they're different languages because they have historically separated. They're also related to French and Italian because they all kind of descend from the Latin roots. And you can trace that process back to reconstruct these Indo-European languages that actually Sanskrit and Latin can be reconstructed to the same roots. And so we thought the same thing could maybe happen with music. Maybe we can reconstruct proto-music and use this to trace the movement of peoples and cultures throughout the world. Our results have been somewhat mixed. We started off finding these correlations in Taiwan, and we have a study that's currently in the review process where we expanded this to a global scale. And we actually found much weaker support than we were suspecting. We found that the musical patterns actually didn't match the genetic patterns so well, and they also didn't match the linguistic patterns so well. And even the linguistic and the genetic patterns didn't match each other as well as many people had thought. So I think this is evidence that there's actually human cultural and biological evolution are a little bit more separate and decoupled than many in my field had kind of thought they would be.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about music copyright laws?
So music copyright is fascinating because it's a great example of applied cultural evolution of music. So the way that Western copyright law, particularly in the US, which is the dominant kind of music industry, works, is they say you can't copy too much of someone else's music or you infringe their copyright.
Yeah.
And the way that they define that is it has to be original expression. And so I've told you that many features of music are found almost universally. So you can't copyright, a pentatonic scale. You can't copyright a rhythm with 2 beats. It's not original. Everyone does that. And so what you can copyright in the Western system is the melody, the precise pattern of notes, as represented in staff notation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people would say that's just a Western Eurocentric thing because that's the way that Western music is notated. Others would say it makes sense because that's where more of the variation is. I'm kind of agnostic about whether that's the best way to do it or not. But we have found that when you use methods to analyze melodic similarity and melodic change that are kind of based on genetic evolution, so if you treat a melody as a sequence of notes, like C's and D's and G's, you can use the same algorithms that geneticists use to understand changes in genetic sequences, where they model nucleotides as C's and G's and A's and T's. Mm-hmm. You can use those methods to kind of quantify how similar are 2 melodies and how likely are these melodies to change at this spot or that spot. And when we do that, we find that those algorithms can actually predict the historical results of copyright cases fairly well. If 2 melodies are more than 50% identical, they're quite likely to have been found liable for copyright infringement. It's not a hard and fast rule. It depends a lot on the context, but on average, that's what we found.
That's really interesting. So going back to cross-cultural work, what are some of the biggest challenges that you find there doing cross-cultural work, particularly in music cognition?
So the challenges for music cognition cross-culturally are very many. The first thing is, how do you know that you're comparing the right things together? Comparing apples with apples or oranges with oranges. Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard to do. Inspired my original research started off inspired by Alan Lomax's Cantometrics project. So Alan Lomax was a well-known ethnomusicologist and folklorist who devised a system by which you could theoretically compare any song around the world based on these 37 different features, which include some things like rhythms and melodies, but also things like how people sang, whether they sang with a loud or soft, fast or slow, a wide or a narrow kind of vocalizing style. And his was a really ambitious project trying to compare music around the world. And it was quite controversial for many reasons. One reason people said, well, you can't compare, even if it's singing, it sounds the same kind of singing. If the meaning is different, you can't compare it. And I'm not as convinced by that. I think you can compare meaning and you can compare sounds separately or together. They can tell us different things. But then other people, so he also kind of said that he used this comparisons to say that musical style was kind of connected to your social structure. So if you're in a very rigid hierarchical society, you're going to sing very rigid, narrow singing. If you're in a very egalitarian society, you're going to sing very group-based, fluid kind of singing. And the statistics of that were kind of criticized, and Yeah, it was quite controversial. Um, and so the challenge there is comparing, making sure you're comparing the right things with the right things. And maybe the big overall challenge here was, so Alan Lomax is a white guy. I'm a white guy. If I listen to the music of Japanese fishermen, I listen to the music of a Central African hunter-gatherer, and I rate it as being a very wide voice, a very narrow voice. How do we know that the fisherman or the hunter-gatherer would also do it the same way? And the answer is we don't know. Um, and so we need to really do those kinds of experiments to test it out. And so far we haven't, my group has not done too much of that. There has been some good progress on cross-cultural music cognition that suggests there is variability, but there's also a lot of universals in music perception. For example, my colleague Nori Jacobi has done this really fantastic study of rhythm perception all around the world with I think about 1,000 participants and from dozens of different cultures. I've contributed some data, and my students and colleagues from Japan have contributed some data, but and really striking similarities in perception. But that's one of the only studies to do this kind of perceptual cross-cultural study on a global scale. There's a few here and there that done 2 cultures at a time, but there's like thousands of languages in the world, so just looking at 2 at a time doesn't really necessarily mean you can say much about the whole world. So it's a very open field, but it's also very thriving. There's a lot of interest in this recently, and there's cool studies coming out every day. Just yesterday, there was a study on the front page of the New York Times looking at cross-cultural diversity and universality in music and speech perception as far as songs and speech to infants from the Music Lab over in Yale, formerly Harvard. And yeah, it's kind of exciting stuff. And I think we're going to see more and more studies like that all the time. Now, the big challenge that I think we still haven't really addressed well is how to do that, as I mentioned, with people from around the world. So it's still kind of, me, other white guys kind of leading the studies. We're studying very diverse musics, but our research teams are not necessarily as diverse as the musics we're studying. Mm-hmm. Often, we'll go into some community and kind of collect recordings. We'll pay them for their time or whatever, but then they're not kind of co-creating knowledge. They're not collaborating on the papers as co-authors. Not presenting at conferences together. It's kind of the power balance is not equal there. And so more and more people in our field and in other fields and science are saying we need to go beyond that sort of colonial way of doing research, and we need to be equal partnerships and cross-cultural collaborations that the researchers are as diverse as the kinds of musics or whatever that we're studying. And I think some groups are kind of making small baby steps there. I just gave a presentation today with a team that includes co-authors from Nigeria, South Africa, Portugal, but originally from Egypt, Japan, India, kind of all over the place. And we're trying to do more and more of these kinds of global, equitable collaborations. But it's hard. You can't just undo centuries worth of colonial legacy in a day. It takes time to do.
Mm-hmm. Does musicology suffer from a weird problem? Is it too centered on weird music or not?
Yes, I mean, it does. And that goes to exactly what I was saying about this kind of diversity of the subject and of the researchers. So historically, musicology as a field was kind of vastly dominated. It was by and for white people, especially white men, Western, classical music, white people studying the great white composers, Beethoven, Bach, whatever. And then in the last few decades, people have said, that's weird. We need to study more different kinds of musics. And so then people like me and some of the others I mentioned have gone out and Alan Lomax and ethnomusicologists going back around 100 years or so said we need to study all the musics of the world. And we've gone out and recorded musics and compared them and so on. So that solves one half of the weird problem. We're now not looking at just weird music, kind of white Western music. We're now looking at all kinds of music, but it's still been predominantly done by white people, white men mainly. And so I think we're still just in the early stages of solving the weird problem of researchers. We're kind of, if we're 50% towards solving the weird problem of the musical subject, we're like 5% towards solving the weird problem of the researchers themselves, ourselves. But we're going in the right direction.
Right. And how do you go about building global networks to study music cross-culturally?
Well, you just need to be aware of the issue and reach out and listen and be ready to listen to other people. And the best way to do it is just ask people, say, hey, I would like to collaborate with more people. Does anyone want to collaborate together? So just a week and a half ago, I sent out an email to this International Council for Traditional Music email list and said, hey, I'm doing this project comparing speech and song around the world. And we'd love to collaborate with people who are themselves native speakers of diverse languages who are willing to sing songs and speak speech in their own language, record it, and then analyze together. And we'll do a big, collaborative paper with 50 or 100 authors and look at 50 or 100 languages around the world. Anyone want to do this together? And I had a great response. Most people said, yes, count me in. And then I get to the conference that I'm at right now. There's like hundreds of researchers from all around the world specialize in traditional music. And I just go around the coffee table and say, hi, I'm Pat, what's your name? Where are you from? What languages do you speak? Would you like to collaborate on this project I'm doing? And half the time they say, yeah, that sounds great. And the other half, no. And a quarter of the time they say, I'm too busy or I don't have the right expertise, but hey, my friend does. Let me connect you with them. And then maybe 5% of the time they say, no, you can never compare music across culturally, and I don't want to do this. No, that's fine. You don't have to do that. You don't have to be interested in the same questions. But yeah, you just have to kind of reach out. And the problem is we just all have our own networks. I'm a white guy, and I just tend to meet more white guys who are like me. And so if I just go with my friends, it's just going to end up being kind of not a very diverse team. So I need to think, okay, who am I missing from this picture, and how can I try to reach out beyond that? And if you just are open to that, it works pretty well. And I gotta say, maybe this kind of goes around to the opening question about why did music evolve? Music is a great way to make these connections. So a lot of the researchers who've said they're interested in collaborating, especially from kind of less well-represented indigenous cultures or languages, are ones who I met at these conferences years ago, and they were maybe doing a workshop. So I was doing a workshop on traditional music of the Rukai group in Taiwan, or Ainu music in Japan, or South African Zulu dance from South Africa. And so I joined the workshop, and we danced together, and we sang together. We became friends, Facebook friends. At the time, I wasn't thinking, I'm going to collaborate with these people in 10 years on a music speech project. But then we're friends on Facebook. And then just yesterday, I was like, oh yeah, I'm looking for more speakers of African languages. I remember Fabile, she's from South Africa. She speaks Zulu. And I say, hey, Fabile, good to see you again. Do you want to collaborate? She says, yeah, that's great. So music helps make these connections so much easier. It's so much easier to bond. So next time you go out and you want to meet people, you should make music together, and it forms these really long-term friendships.
Great. So one last question. What would you say are some of the most interesting unexplored questions and topics in musicology that you think more work should be done on?
Well, of course, I'm biased towards some more than others, like the ones that I'm kind of currently working on. So with that kind of bias being acknowledged, I think the language-music connection is really fascinating and understudied. Everyone knows that language and music are connected, but no one really knows how or why. There's almost no data cross-culturally on how singing and speaking are similar or different across cultures. And I think part of the problem has been because you need to know a language to really do this. And so we haven't had these collaborative networks of people who can speak languages. So if you're only looking at the musical sound, as I did my own research, and many, Lomax did, you're only getting half of the picture. You're missing the meaning of the words. So I think now is a good time for that we have researchers who can speak these languages and collaborate together. So that's one unopened question, unanswered question. And there's a lot of open questions. The cross species stuff is really interesting. So how does music and animal song, how are they similar, different? How do they evolve? What's the value of music? I like to think of as social bonding, but it could be something else. But it has to be very valuable to, it takes a lot of time and energy to make music. Every culture does it, so it can't just be random. It can't just be something that you do because it's just interesting, because you wouldn't have every single culture doing it. And yet, because we don't really know what the precise value of music is to society, it's easy to say when it comes time to make funding cuts, well, let's just cut the music program because we need to teach people to read and write. We need to teach them to do math so they can get jobs. Music is not valuable to society. So if they want to make music, they can do that on their own time. And so most of us who study music think that's horrible, because we feel in our bones that music is very valuable, but we kind of don't have really strong evidence, scientific evidence, to kind of prove the point. Some of the studies that claim to find evidence, like the Mozart effect, saying, oh, listening to music makes you smarter, didn't seem to really pan out, seemed to be kind of wishful thinking. And that may be the case for some of the music therapy, saying music heals you. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I think the evidence right now is not as strong enough to make a good case. So I think more scientific evidence for the value of music to society would be a benefit to all of us. And I think that's a really important open question.
Mm-hmm. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet? And also if you want to mention some of the topics you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, I think I've kind of covered a lot of the topics that we work on. You can certainly find most of our information. The best place to look is at my lab webpage, which is compmusic.info. So CompMusic.info. And we have a couple of kind of our big papers that have been covered in the news that kind of give you a flavor of the stuff we do. And it's quite diverse, biological evolution, cultural evolution, this kind of collaborative, building collaborative network stuff, kind of cross-cultural perception, music information retrieval using algorithms, copyright stuff. And I'd love to have more collaborators and students. So if anyone is listening to this and says, hey, I'd love to study that stuff, check out the website and send me an email. If you say, hey, I'd love to collaborate on research together, check out the website and send me an email. My email is psavage@sfc.ko.ac.jp. You can find us again on the website. So just check out compmusic.info. I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
It's been my pleasure, Ricardo. Thank you for, you obviously spent a lot of time looking at my materials to come up with these questions. So I appreciate it. And it's an honor and a pleasure to share the love of music with you and with your audience. So, obrigado.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to help me keep the channel sustainable, please visit my Patreon page or PayPal and consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like and hit the subscription button. The show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Parago Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alec, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Cabana, Mark Blythe, Roberto Iguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Dugny, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslin Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Todd Shackelford. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Elder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.